Hi, everybody. I'd like to take just a couple minutes to talk about the Milestone 2 assignment. And first and foremost, these two sections, the methods and the outcome section, have a tendency to be by far the most challenging sections of the final paper. Please know that I am very well aware of that and that I grade accordingly, especially in this particular draft, because I know this part's hard. So most of you guys already know, because hopefully you've seen your feedback, that most of you guys got all of your points, or at least most of your points, for your Milestone One submission. And that's because I understand that this is a draft and that you're probably going to have some things that you need to adjust. So please don't get stressed. And most importantly, if you have questions not answered by this video, please reach out. I'm happy to help you. So the first part is going to be, what did they measure? So in other words, what were the variables involved here? So what specifically were they trying to measure? And then just as importantly, your other question is exactly how did they measure it? Was it a survey? Was it interviews? Did they do an experiment and see what happened? So what was it exactly they were trying to measure, and how did they go about measuring it? As long as you stick right now with just trying to answer those couple of basic questions, you really should be just fine for that section of the paper. Now, the second part of this question, what, if any, assumptions did the researchers make in order to conduct their research? This one can be a little bit tricky. And notice that it says, what, if any, assumptions. So they're not always going to be there, but typically they're there. They just might be a little bit hidden. And I'm going to give you an example. But first, I think I should probably make sure an assumption is, like when you assume that something is true. So basically, it's something that we just kind of take for granted that we think is correct. So in this previous research article that we used to use for this class, the researcher, in part, for part of the study, interviewed people that had been convicted of a crime and interviewed them about how things like fees, fines, stuff like that, contribute to difficulties that they have after they've been convicted, like how these fees and stuff can sometimes already make kind of a hard time worse. And so one of the assumptions that this researcher made is that all of the people that she interviewed are going to be honest with her. And especially whenever you're dealing with interview data, this is most definitely an assumption that a lot of researchers are going to make, because what's the point of interviewing them if you don't think they're going to be fairly honest, right? So pretty much anytime you see an assumption, anytime you see an article that involves any kind of interview data or survey data, which most of these articles do, a major assumption that the researchers are making is that their answers that they get from participants are going to be honest. And that is a way that you could kind of critique, right? Because there are various reasons that sometimes people wouldn't necessarily be honest. So it's important to bring these things up, and that's why that part of the question is there. Another place that you might go to look for examples of things that are assumptions is look in the research article for where they address limitations. And so you can kind of see some evidence there. Sometimes it's a little bit hidden, but it's frequently there. So again, in this study, they interviewed people. So you might think, hey, they assumed that they were being honest. But what they also did is that they looked at public records data of fines and court costs and stuff like that to kind of see, is the information they're getting from the interviews, like when people are telling them how much their fines are and stuff like that, are they accurate? And so they looked at some public records data to see whether or not the actual numbers backed up what people were saying in the interviews. So you could actually argue that one of the assumptions here in this particular article is that they knew there was a chance that people might not necessarily remember or report their financial obligations accurately. So because of this assumption, they chose to back it up through public records data. And a lot of the time, if you look in the limitation section, there are ideas that you can get for something that they assumed. And again, please don't get too hung up on this assumptions part because it can be really hard. It's not something that's automatically spelled out in most studies. You kind of got to look for it. So again, if you're struggling with that part, please do not hesitate to reach out. So again, to sum up for the first section for the methods, just cover what was measured, how was it measured, and what did the researchers seem to take for granted or assume was true. And as long as you've made an attempt to address these issues, these particular questions, your method section will be totally fine for this draft. So for part 2, it says, examine the outcomes of those tests. What were the major findings? And what's really important for you to make sure you do is that you make a connection to either the research questions and or the study's purpose. So if they ask some specific questions, basically what were the answers to those questions? What did they find out? If their purpose, which for several of these studies, their purpose is to just like examine a situation and see what they can learn about it, what exactly did they find out from that examination? And again, as long as you're making some kind of an effort to connect that to the original questions or the purpose, you should be good. But the part I really want to make sure that I mention here is something that's embedded in the rubric. And in the outcome section of the rubric, you see here where it says statistical significance. So what you want to look for to determine whether or not something was statistically significant. And I'm going to post an extra video to give you a little bit more in-depth example too, is you're looking for something called a p-value. Now, not every study that you guys had to choose from is going to have a p-value. Statistical significance only happens if it's a research study where they were actually looking at numerical data. So if your study was nothing but interviews and they didn't actually measure anything, it's called quantitative, which is when they measure something numerically. So you won't have a p-value and you won't address statistical significance if you had one of those studies. But a lot of the studies do have statistical aspects to them. So where do you go to find the p-value? So this is another study that we used to use for this class, and the purpose of this research was exactly what the title suggests. They were looking to see if negative experiences in your childhood, poverty, abuse, stuff like that, is related to later in life taking medication for psychotropic issues. And in their results section, they did make a conclusion that ACM, which is just the abbreviation that they use to mean childhood misfortune experiences, it says that there's a relationship between that and taking medication, and that misfortune increases the likelihood of taking medication. And so they definitely said, yes, there is a relationship between those two things, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's statistically significant. So that's why you have to look for this right here. So again, this is called a p-value. And what that means is it's a percentage. And it basically means what is the probability that this result or this conclusion that they found is just because of chance and not because there's an actual relationship. And so what seems kind of weird and backwards thinking is that the smaller a p-value is, the more significant. And so as you can see here, that number 0.001, that's literally 1 out of 1,000. So that's a very small probability. So that means they can be pretty sure that the connection they found between childhood misfortune and taking medication is actually a real thing, and it's not just due to some like error or mistake or just random chance. So if you have a p-value that is small, that means that it is statistically significant. And they will typically just put it right in there when they make their conclusion. You don't need to say anything other than the p-value was this, which means it's statistically significant. Typically, we call anything statistically significant if it's smaller than 0.05. That's kind of a general standard. If it's smaller than 0.05, typically we're going to say that that is significant. And again, if you've got any extra questions about this, I know I'm just giving you a really basic overview. I'm totally happy to help. The other thing I want to make sure that I point out to you on this rubric before we get out of here, thanks for listening, is this part of the rubric right here that says Incorporation of Feedback from Milestone One. So each of you guys has your graded rubric that I already gave you for your Milestone One, and you should see attached to your overall feedback that I attached a copy of your paper and with all of my comments and questions about each section of your paper. And those comments will be over on the side of your paper and look something like this. So you'll see like part of your paper highlighted, and then there'll be a comment that goes along with it right next to it. If for some reason, I know sometimes depending on what program you're using and you're looking at, I know sometimes that these comments might not necessarily show up. So please, the second you get a chance, look at your paper, make sure that you can actually see these comments, and I will get you another copy ASAP if you can't actually see those comments. Because again, it's going to be important for the rubric for your Milestone 2. Because just whether or not you made changes based on my feedback is a quarter, like 1/4 of your grade. So if you can't see your comments, if you see it but you don't really understand what I'm asking for, please by all means make sure you reach out to me too, and I will definitely help you with that. And so hopefully this gives you a little bit of a place to start. And again, I've uploaded also another video that talks about the p-value, but the most important thing is to not hesitate at all to reach out, guys. Like, I am super available. I know that this part is going to be challenging, so I really just want to be able to help. So, you know how to get a hold of me? It would help if I wrote this down right. There we go. So I am ready and willing and able to be standing by to answer any questions that you have. Talk to you later.